Ink ribbons are not bad game design. I've come today to talk about the most important topic in the world. If you argue that something else is more worth your time, you are wrong, and I will give you the DSP treatment.
Banned, 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 banned. Gone. Forever.
This is the discussion of a lifetime on a topic that I need to put to rest once and for all. That topic is a 90s PlayStation game. If Billy Mitchell can sue over video game high scores, I can bitch about a survival horror game. God damn it. Okay, to tone it down a few decibels, we're going to be talking about game design and demystifying a game mechanic from a 90s PlayStation game. You saw my thumbnail. You know that today we will be discussing ink ribbons, a long forgotten, archaic remnant of a more sadistic era. One where developers gleefully tormented their players, yet gaslighted them into thinking they were playing the greatest games ever made. Or at least that's what the anime profile pictures on Discord and Twitter want you to believe. Oh shit, Twitter. I didn't really fuck with that site. I'm cool with Twitter dying. I hope Reddit is next. Okay, truth be told, no one out there is going out of their way to make a bad game. Nope, I'm wrong about that too. Let me rephrase that. No one is going out of their way to make a bad product. Everything is made with the intention of getting you to buy it and hopefully also enjoy it on some level. Games may be misguided, lacking in funds, talent or ideas, or they're under oppressive leadership that doesn't understand or value the craft of making a video game. However, there's a rare category that I find the older Resident Evil games consistently fall into. They're misunderstood. They're looked at from a future perspective they simply couldn't have accounted for. And this tends to be the case for more than just ink ribbons. Not that having a different perspective about a game is wrong. I find that people who have a different opinion than me are really interesting to have an intellectual discussion with. The comments on my Devil May Cry video are very much proof of this. I learned so much crazy stuff about my favorite game in just one miniature forum. Many times I learn not only something new about the game, but also about myself. However, variety is a spice of life, except for quirky indie Earthbound-inspired RPGs. The problem is when one perspective is the only perspective you choose to indulge in. The problem is when the discussion stops being intellectual. And the extremist in the debate around ink ribbons is a textbook case. I want to make something very clear right now. In my video about auto assist in the Devil May Cry games, I very much sat in the middle. How you chose to play the game was perfectly fine with me, so long as you didn't harass anyone. For the most part, this video will share the same sentiment, regardless of how you personally feel about this one mechanic. As a matter of fact, how both you and I feel about this mechanic is one of the secondary focuses of this video. There's a more important thing I want to talk about. Before we go into that though, I just wanted to say this video will have a twist. I am choosing a definitive side, and I'm saying right now that I am 100% in favor of ink ribbons, and I can say with absolute confidence that ink ribbons are not bad game design. But don't take my opinion at face value. I will be providing my own arguments to explain why I hold this opinion so firmly. And this won't be a one-sided video. I can sympathize for the majority of people who get frustrated with ink ribbons. So in a similar fashion to my DMC video, I will be breaking down both opinions and try to present everything without bias. The only people who should really feel voice crack. Let's do it again but not cringe. The only people who should really feel attacked by this video are people who spread misinformation about these amazing games. You'll see what I'm talking about soon. But first, to give you some much needed context, here's my story of how I became a participant in this debate unwillingly, and why I so badly wanted to make this video. Here comes a little bit of Rain and Noodle's story time. Just like my experience with auto assist, my take on ink ribbons comes mostly from first-hand experience. And honestly, I imagine this is how most people watching this video now came to whatever feelings they hold currently. My tale starts with several streams in Discord servers. Before I started making YouTube videos, I would go into random Discord servers and sit around in voice chat. This would take place in a number of communities, from Metal Gear fucking Zace to Tekken to Quake. I would feel compelled to start streaming a game, and one of my frequent ones was Resident Evil. I've been playing Resident Evil ever since I was in high school, and you could say I'm familiar with them. It's become one of my comfort games, something I can play over and over again and never become bored with. But you might recall a second ago where I stated that I often streamed in communities that had nothing to do with Resident Evil. It didn't really matter if the people who watched were friends or strangers. These streams would usually go one of two ways. Half the time, people would comment positively and become invested in the game. The other half of the time, though, people would make fun of various things about the games. Normally, this doesn't bother me much. An opinion is an opinion. And who can really blame them for thinking these games were silly?
Chris? Stop it!
These games are absolutely riddled with absurd events and dialogue. Sometimes, there was the tertiary option, where we would all stare at Jill Valentine's ginormous cake as she watched down the hall. I am the storm that is approaching. Regardless of how it went, eventually someone would bring up ink ribbons. And I swear, every time someone complained about ink ribbons, it was the exact same line. Why would they limit the number of times you can save? That's bad game design. It limits exploration. I can usually ignore any other comments people made about the games, but for whatever reason, this one always got under my skin. It may sound mentally insane, but ink ribbons are actually one of the biggest reasons I enjoy playing RE. Resident Evil 7 is my most favorite game in the entire series, but I absolutely refuse to play it on any difficulty that isn't Madhouse. Half of it is because I genuinely prefer the challenge, but the other half is purely because of this game's version of ink ribbons. For those unfamiliar, RE6 fans, let me sum these guys up real quick. The way ink ribbons work is you take them to a typewriter. A typewriter will enable you to save your game, and it keeps track of your health, your progress in the game, your inventory, and what room you are in. Every single time you wish to save, it will consume one ink ribbon. So if you don't have any ink ribbons, you cannot save until you find more. To me, a Resident Evil game simply isn't a Resident Evil game without ink ribbons. However, for some, ink ribbons take away from the experience. And for an even smaller group, it's one of the things that leads people to hate on and spread misinformation about the games. This means that unfortunately an argument breaks out, and I'm usually not always flattered by the outcome. However, it's never been the fact that these people think differently that bothers me. I would honestly prefer people be able to form their own opinions and stand up for them. What gets me angry is that some people who make these comments make completely invalid criticisms that aren't even remotely true, no matter which way you spin it. It's when we leave the realm of opinion and start to delve into misinformation that I start to actually get kind of pissed. You can dislike Resident Evil, and I will never hold it against you. Survival horror is not for everyone. Just make sure your reasoning isn't literally a conspiracy theory. The second you come to one of my streams, or I guess videos now, and try to convince people who don't know much that the game works differently than it actually does, that's when I'm going to have a problem with you. If you happen to be nervous about trying out Resident Evil because one of these idiots said something scary about ink ribbons, this video is also for you. So let's finally clear the air and get into the nitty-gritty of each side of this debate. First, I wanted to point the spotlight on the other side, specifically the criticism I hear that is 100% understandable. Before I start gushing about ink ribbons, I wanted to have a little humility and point out that, yes, it does in fact have its flaws. Just like any other game mechanic, it's simply not perfect. The biggest imperfection is it can be a pain in the ass if you're not used to it. I mean, just think about it. Since the early days of gaming, the habit of saving as often as possible has been drilled into us. Even back then, before we had our Bethesda games with 200 of your weird obscure fetish mods. Yes, that's right, I'm calling you out, you sick bastards. It was always such a big pain in the ass when your game decides it would be really hilarious if it just kind of stopped working. Because odds are, whatever you were working towards in the game is now completely gone. This was especially the case before autosaving became a standard feature. There's also the event that you have a life, and something just comes up that is much more important than a video game. I'd ideally want to pick up where I left off later, were that to happen. it's been drilled into each and every one of us that we save every chance we get, as to avoid any future anguish later on. Because life has enough suffering, God forbid video games have it too. So what exactly do you do when you pop in a new game, only to find out the save points in the game demand an item from you? What some people did is they still kept saving a lot, expecting to find more all over the place. They thought this was some experimental mechanic or existed to better immerse players in the game scenario. Not all, but some players would clear a room of enemies, run back, save, run back, clear another room, run back, save, rinse and repeat. You better not do this, by the way. However, this put them into a situation where now they didn't have an ink ribbon for every room they clear, and now they have to make a large amount of progress without any insurance for their save file. This was especially bad because Resident Evil can be particularly brutal. It is extremely rare for these games to spare you any mercy whatsoever. Not only does the game punish you for doing what you thought was a good idea, but now it's going to throw you into a challenging situation you might not be prepared for. In an effort to make the game feel scarier, the developers tended to create really trollish spawns and attacks for enemies. Usually this happens right before or after save rooms, but if you can't save, this can really work against you. So when people say ink ribbons make the game too hard or too stressful, I fully understand. What I just talked about was probably the most obvious reason, but it was also one of the biggest, so I wanted to get it out of the way first. However, what about players who aren't new? I've actually heard complaints about ink ribbons being a waste of time. Think about it. To save, you must go to the item box. Then you need to navigate the item box. Then you need to make room for the ribbon. However, you can't just take one ribbon. You need to take the entire stack. So you grab the stack of ribbons and close the item box. Then you walk over to the typewriter. You interact with the typewriter, and you tell it you want to save. Then you save. You're kicked back into the game. But there's one problem. You still have ink ribbons, because you couldn't just grab one, you had to grab the whole stack. Because apparently Jill and Chris are insanely greedy hoes. So now you run back to the item box. Then you have to open it and navigate the box again, and you put the extra ribbons in there for later. Then you walk away from the box, and you pray you didn't forget something during that entire journey of simply saving your game. Now tell me, doesn't that sound like a gigantic pain in the ass just to save once? I've heard people complain that they're not even really that frustrated with the concept of limited saves. They're annoyed with the fact that it's tied to an item specifically, and that the process for using that one item is so monotonous, tedious, and time-consuming. This is another stance I can completely get behind. Another reason also ties into the game's inventory system. You only have so many inventory spaces to work with. If you bring a pistol, a knife, some ammo, an herb, and heaven forbid, you play on the higher difficulties and also need to bring some ink ribbons themselves, you're ultimately left with a few inventory slots. That one ink ribbon is hoarding out a slot that frankly could be used for something more worthwhile. That is if you didn't need it to save. Thankfully, on the normal difficulty, you can utilize item boxes, and your item box inventory will be available throughout every save room in the game. But what happens when you find ink ribbons out and about? The game can sometimes make you carry between 2 to 4 different items you need on you to complete puzzles. At many points in the game, like the mansion, you need to be carrying a key on you to progress further in the game. So if you're low on ink ribbons, you likely want to grab some. However, you also can't just drop an item anywhere, and you especially can't pick it back up once you do. When you drop an item in old school Resident Evil, it's gone forever. Does the floor eat it or something? I'm not sure, but it's gone like 50% of the people who clicked on this video. By the way, can we declare watching a YouTube video a battle royale? If you think about it, even the god tier YouTubers only have like 20% of their audience make it to the end of the video, so I think it should be. Sorry, I was having a Gen Z cringe moment. Back on topic. This puts you in a tough spot where you need to decide how much an ink ribbon is worth to you. You may have to waste an entire green herb just to make room for one if you're desperate, or walk around the mansion with a less than ideal loadout just in case you happen to find something you'll need later. This can create another really stressful situation for a new player, and especially sometimes even a veteran player. Another reason are player-made soft locks. Sometimes you make a big mistake. You use some ammo on an enemy that you probably would have been better off saving for a boss fight. Or maybe you use too much ammo in general and need to replay a portion of the game to hopefully have some more on the next try. You weren't resourceful enough with your herbs and now you're low on health, stuck between rooms filled with enemies. This would be excruciatingly painful if you happen to be the kind of person to create all of your saves in the same slot. I actually used to do this all the time, but Resident Evil taught me why that wasn't the best idea. And the way I learned this was getting softlocked myself. Resident Evil 0 just happens to be my first ever Resident Evil game, believe it or not. I know, it's unfortunate. I made it halfway through the game, only to realize I accidentally softlocked myself inside a puzzle room while I had Billy and Rebecca separated. I'd love to work through my Resident Evil 0 PTSD that is eating me up right now as I speak, but it's not the time for that. In short, as a result, I put down RE0 and never finished it until years later. Even if you do happen to spread your saves out, this just means that when you softlock your progress, you have a large chunk of progress you gotta redo. Certainly not as large as starting the entire game over, but big enough to be annoying. Then here comes the real elephant in the room, the people that ink ribbons are designed to stop. It's not a secret that there are some gamers who abuse saving in order to brute force their way through a game. This doesn't apply to everyone, of course, but think of someone like Darkside Phil. As a matter of fact, it was hearing him bitch about running out of ink ribbons in Resident Evil 2 Remake that partially motivated me to make this video.
Is this a fucking save room? Dude, there's no ink ribbons! You've got to be kidding me, there's no ink ribbons. I can't save my game. There's no ink ribbons. Wow. They didn't put any in the room. What the fuck, dude? This fucking sucks.
DSP sadly isn't the only person who is like this. I know tons of people who play every single game exactly like he does. While I tend to lack sympathy for these kinds of players, I do have to admit, it feels kinda bad that they can't cheat at a single player game that they paid money to play, even if they really wanted to. It's a sad thought, but I think we all know some people out there just like that. And game developers know this too. There's a reason why RPGs tend to have so many amazing mechanics, characters, and magic spells, but you can still somehow get through the entire game just by spamming the basic attack and hoarding all your potions, instead of employing any sort of strategy. It's a safeguard implemented for players just like these guys. However, Resident Evil spits on these kinds of players. It doesn't have an attack or mechanic that works in every situation. The reason I bring up brute forcing is because Resident Evil requires that you make the best use possible out of everything, and this directly conflicts with the philosophy of brute forcing through a video game, which is repeating the same scenario over and over again, ultimately making no meaningful use of anything. The final point I want to make is in regards to actually finding the ink ribbons themselves. They're sometimes easy to miss. On a lower resolution screen, the ink ribbons are actually decently easy to see, especially if the devs place a sparkling effect on them. But ironically enough, if you play in an emulator in 4K, they can actually be pretty hard to spot. I'm talking from my own experience months ago where I was revisiting the PSX trilogy. You might actually pass by ink ribbons if you're playing the game for the first time or even the 100th time, and happen to be playing it through an emulator. Emulation is an amazing way to experience any game, but as you can imagine, the developers of the game didn't design the game for emulation. It's designed for a PlayStation 1 on an older TV. So trust me, there will be moments where the usual visual tricks employed in these older games don't exist anymore. In short, I hope your eyesight is better than mine. I think by this point, I've covered my bases on the stance against ink ribbons. Again, I don't think these opinions are unreasonable at all. They actually make a lot of sense to me. However, I'm not done with this video. Lower your PewDiePie chairs and hang on, because I'm going to introduce you to all of the reasons ink ribbons are enjoyable. First, I want to start off by saying that a lot of the reasons I like ink ribbons are actually because of the problems I talked about just before this section. You might ask, how is that even possible? The way I covered it, it seemed like ink ribbons made gameplay feel slower and more frustrating. And yes, they do make the game feel slower, but slow isn't always a bad thing. I think ink ribbons actually enable things in the player that other games don't always manage to do. Resident Evil is a survival horror game. A lot of people who are only vaguely familiar with the games tend to put a lot of emphasis on the horror.
Come on, I dare you to stand up.
They tend to say Resident Evil is a horror game. So when you say a horror game has these things called ink ribbons that you have to collect and use at a typewriter, it doesn't really sound like it makes a lot of sense. Why would something like that even be there? But I think once people really start to get into old school RE, the horror word almost loses all meaning. Once you've played an RE game several times, you already know what's coming next. People are mostly scared of the unknown, but because of the nature of these games, they tend to become less unknown on repeat playthroughs. They can even become second nature. I know Resident Evil 7 like I know the entire Navy SEALs copy pasta. Don't ask me to recite it, I don't perform well under pressure, please. So the horror appeal almost goes away entirely. What doesn't go away is the survival. No matter how much you've played the game, no matter how much of it you have memorized, you still need to use your inventory effectively. You need to use critical thinking skills to determine what is the next best plan of action for the next part of the game. What are you willing to sacrifice? What risks are you willing to take? How can you get more out of each and every bullet? What route will be the safest way to get where you need to go? Inventory management is never the same experience among players, and ink ribbons plays heavily into this experience. Ink ribbons are part of the inventory Tetris of Resident Evil. First, let's address the inventory space. By imposing such massive limits on the player's own ability to be equipped for the rest of the game, you force them to engage with your survival gameplay. The player needs to create a mental list of priorities of what they need and what they can live without. The player already needs to figure out if they need extra leeway to be able to heal, or if they need to be extra capable to defend themselves. But they also need to solve this problem without impeding their progress and leaving ample room for puzzle items and keys. Some players leave things behind knowing they'll revisit the area later, like I tend to do with green herbs. Some players are hoarders and they tend to grab everything in sight, then once their inventory is full, haul it all the way to the storage box. Not recommended, by the way. Ink ribbons serve to make these big choices even more challenging, because now you need to decide if you're willing to give up the ability to save your game in exchange for a greater chance at survival. Even if you don't explicitly bring ink ribbons with you, the inevitability of finding one out and about creates this mental struggle. When you find a ribbon, you're immediately forced to make a tough decision. Starting that very moment, the player needs to adjust the loadout that they have right now in order to accommodate this unforeseen blessing. Ink ribbons are an integral layer to what makes Resident Evil's inventory system. Now let's talk about the absurd amount of time it takes just to save. I personally believe that the developers of the game might have intentionally made saving want to pull your hair out. And once again, it comes all the way back to prompting the player to take risks. I'm a full-grown adult who works a full-time job, with a family that I help support. I also make YouTube videos on the side, if you didn't notice. I do not get a lot of time to sit down and play a video game. So for someone like me, ink ribbons taking so much game time away just for basic maintenance is just not worth it. I'm happy enough with taking the risk and not saving. And that's exactly what the developers want you to do. They want to instigate risk-taking in the player. If the player has to go longer periods of time without saving, it makes the game way scarier and more anxiety-inducing. It keeps you on your toes. And even if I did have a lot of free time to sit down and play a video game all day, I still wouldn't save often, because saving in this game is such a chore. It ultimately makes sure that no matter what, you only save precisely when it is worth it to do so. If saving was easy, I could slowly clear out every room reloading my save until I eventually get a run where I use as few bullets as possible. I might even just brute force my way through the game with a knife. The game would be completely broken and way too easy. But ink ribbons make that strategy impractical, and there are more rooms to explore than there are ink ribbons. So I need to be happy with imperfections and make a gamble. The nice thing about this though is you are taking a gamble on yourself. It's not some random number generator or something else in the game to go your way. Well, assuming you can trust yourself to do anything competently, because I can't. This means that whatever risks you take are based entirely on your own abilities. Ink ribbons mean that every save you make is a meaningful one, but it also begs the player to develop confidence and trust in their own abilities in the game. It's motivation to learn to not be bad at the game.
Bad. You're bad. You fucking suck.
Your future hinges upon this fight.
Ink ribbons also make the game significantly more challenging. I get that not everybody likes hard games. By the way, headphone warning.
Let me fucking leave, dude!
But I do. I personally just do not find an easy game that interesting. A game that's too easy can easily put me to sleep, but when it comes to Resident Evil, I can pull all-nighters. Because every moment my heart is pounding. Every turn around a corner, a hunter could use a trolley one-shot kill move, and my absurdly good run could end in just a few frames. The thought of losing a massive chunk of progress is much scarier than any monster the developers could have put into the game. That intensity just would not be there if I wasn't incentivized to avoid saving as much as possible. It puts me into full fight or flight response, as if my life fully depended on me not dying in this decades-old video game. I find myself slowly and quietly walking through the mansion as if I was in the game myself, trying to preserve my own life. It sounds absurd and even a little bit uncomfortable, but I assure you, I have the most fun with video games that force me to use 100% of my brain and reflexes at all times. What I just described is really no different from that of someone who binges FromSoft games. Hell, I know it describes a lot of DMC players perfectly. The game creates an intense experience, an atmosphere that completely envelops you, begging you to prove your worth. You're proving that you're not just able to handle a horror game. You're proving that you're capable of fighting off everything big and small, piling up to insurmountable odds. And one little item that takes up one little inventory slot is never going to stop you. There's one final idea that I want you to consider before I move on to the next section. It was a genius idea that I sadly can't take all the credit for. When I was doing my research for this video, I found an old thread on a forum somewhere, and this is the sentiment that one person had posted. Ink ribbons are an empowering aspect of the game's overall story. Think about it. You are the lone survivor. The majority of the time in these games, you're lucky if you ever come across another person. It happens so infrequently that it tends to isolate you. You're always wondering if you're going to stumble across the remains of one of your fellow partners. That stranger you just met at the beginning of the game might be the most important person in the world right now, along with you, and you haven't even the slightest clue if they're even still alive. So you use ink ribbons to tide over your anxiety. You leave notes behind and hope that you can communicate with your partner. You write up a diary of what's happened so far, both to maintain your own sanity and subdue your isolation, but also in hopes that someone else will find it, if they even do. It's producing proof that you existed so that you may hopefully not be forgotten and left behind, should you never make it out alive. Ink ribbons are an amazing way to become further immersed in the game, and one of the ways that the game makes you actually feel like the lone survivor. Ink ribbons are also valuable in another way, which is high scores. At the end of a Resident Evil game, you are given a letter rank, and that rank is dependent on several factors. Once again, we're using Darkside Phil as an example. I'm sure he won't mind. I know I've been talking about him a lot in this video. It's because I'm also making a documentary about him, which, by the way, get subscribed for that. One of those factors is how many ink ribbons you've used. This makes ink ribbon usage a competition, and now when you want to replay the game, you don't simply want to play the game again. You want to leave with a new personal best. You want to work up to the point that you don't even need a single ink ribbon at all. It is an addicting and empowering feeling, to say the least. I think I've said my piece on ink ribbons. To sum it up, ink ribbons exist to enrich the challenge and atmosphere of the game. A Resident Evil game simply would not feel like a true Resident Evil game if ink ribbons didn't exist in at least some sort of way. But there's an elephant in the room. I still haven't fully answered every question you might have about ink ribbons. Luckily for you, this is what our next section is for, and while we're at it, we can cover and correct some of the blatant misinformation I've seen about ink ribbons. Now, when you ask around about ink ribbons, people tend to get very passionate about this topic, and they leave out a lot of objectivity. I'm going to try to leave out my own bias towards ink ribbons and simply state the facts as I cover these. Here's some of the misinformation that I hear often. Number 1, ink ribbons are rare. I've already kind of talked about this, but I've only covered half of what I wanted to say. Ink ribbons are not rare. They are almost literally everywhere. I said earlier that sometimes you'll accidentally pass over ink ribbons. This can be true, but the game has so many that it's honestly impossible for you to run out of them unless you're being really irresponsible with them. I'll usually finish an RE game with no cap around like 20 to 30 ink ribbons just sitting in my storage box waiting to be used. As a matter of fact, that 2030 figure is from my first playthroughs of these games. So odds are good I didn't need to collect all of them. I've gotten so good at these games that nowadays I'll have around 3/4 of all the ribbons in the game go completely unused. Just because ink ribbons are a resource that should be used sparingly doesn't necessarily mean that they are rare. Water is something we all need. Some of us need gamer girl bathwater. Some of us are bad to the bone and drink water mixed with nasty BS that they eventually call beer. Regardless of your H2O choice, we all get a little thirsty. Every time we use it, we need to make sure that it is for a good reason because it is not unlimited. However, most of our planet is in fact made of water. We have developed ways to take whichever water we please, whether it be from an ocean, from the rain, from a lake, etc., to make it safe for consumption. We will likely not run out of water anytime soon, but that doesn't mean you should ever waste it. It's the same exact thing with ink ribbons. You can find ink ribbons really easily sitting on top of a good number of tables in these games. They even put them right next to the typewriters. There are so many ink ribbons in these games that, no offense, you would need to be doing something seriously wrong to not have enough to work with. Again, you would absolutely need to be someone like DSP. Number 2, they limit exploration. Does anyone have the same question whenever they hear this? I honestly wonder if anyone who says this has even played the games. So let's break this down logically. Let's say you ran out of ink ribbons and you really need to save. For this comment to actually be true, you would have to find some way to play the game without switching rooms. So does that mean that my only option is to just sit there with my game running and wait until the game pities me enough and gives me some free ink ribbons? Absolutely not. Any reasonable person would start going into rooms deliberately looking for ink ribbons, or in other words, they would immediately start exploring. Ink ribbons were never a requirement for opening doors. You can open most doors with a completely empty inventory, in fact. Ink ribbons, as a matter of fact, are a reward for exploring. The only way ink ribbons can really impact exploration is through a soft lock. But that soft lock isn't there explicitly because of the ink ribbon, it's there due to user error. The ink ribbon simply makes the problem slightly worse. I hope you can start to see why these comments bother me, because they wouldn't bother anyone who's actually played these games before. And they tend to get spat out under the disguise of being the truth, which leads people who have never played the games to believe them. Third is ink ribbons are used to pad out the game. This is another comment that genuinely confuses me because Resident Evil games to me always seem like they were never meant to be long in the first place. To really highlight how little sense this claim makes, let's place it within the context of another game. Imagine if we were talking about old school Sonic the Hedgehog and I said to you, the enemies in Sonic exist just to make that game longer. You'd be confused as to how on earth I even came to that conclusion. You can avoid fighting most of the enemies in a Sonic game. As a matter of fact, it might not even be possible to destroy every robot in a level and still make the time limit. One of the incentives to avoid them is to finish the level faster, because the game is grading you based on how fast you can beat the level. Well, what I just described perfectly exonerates Resident Evil of this quote-unquote criticism. You can avoid saving whenever you want. As a matter of fact, if you really wanted to spite the developers for using this cheap tactic to make the game unreasonably long, you could complete the entire game without saving at all. I mean, by this flawed logic, the game would be short enough for this to be possible, right? I would hope this was obvious, but you're not obligated to save every time you move between save rooms. You may feel pressured to, and that's totally fine, but no one's holding a gun to you. Not only that, but avoiding saving pays off, because like I said earlier, not using ink ribbons results in a higher completion rate. And then finally, Resident Evil games aren't even really that long. The first playthrough, even for the newer games, usually takes around 8 to 12 hours. And then on repeat playthroughs, it's really easy to beat the game again in half that time. I can actually beat Resident Evil Village, a full big budget $60 game, in like just under 3 hours. I know I made item boxes sound like a pain in the ass earlier, but they don't take up enough time to magically make a 3-hour long game into a 20-hour long one. With logic this horrible, I can only assume that the developers didn't put ink ribbons in to make the game longer. If that was the sole purpose for them to exist, they're doing a really bad job at it. The most probable conclusion I can draw is that they're there to challenge the player. just like the enemies would be there to challenge the player in a Sonic game. It's the same thing. Number 4. Why would the developers limit your saves? This question itself is innocent enough, but oftentimes it is being asked towards the wrong people. When people ask this, they're not asking me, someone who can adequately provide my own answer based on my own experience with the game. Oftentimes this question is posed to the people who have never played the game in an effort to make the idea of limited saves sound insane. If you watched my previous section about why I like ink ribbons, and even a little bit of the section before that, then you already have a number of bullet points to help you answer this question. But if someone asks this sarcastically, or asks this as a means to slight the game or the people who play it, feel free to call them out on it. By the way, if you're one of these people, stop being a petty bitch. The last and biggest point to go over, number 5. Ink ribbons are bad game design. I saved this one for last because I felt it would be a mouthful to properly explain. It also builds up suspense and makes sure only the people who actually care are here to hear this. Separates the wheat from the chaff, as they say. I am an amateur programmer and game developer. And when I say amateur, I really mean amateur. Like, don't ask me for programming advice. I have no idea what I'm doing. I've spent years making my own video game in my spare time, before starting this YouTube channel. I was even the lead programmer for a few fan games. Every single part of the process of making a video game, I taught myself how to do. And one of the concepts I've spent an absurd amount of time making sure I was doing right was game design. Bad game design is not a mechanic that is used improperly or something that is flat out ignored and just ridiculed. Proper game design is setting goals and making sure your player can hit them. A well-designed game introduces a new mechanic and makes sure that the new mechanic is able to be easily worked with and understood, or at the very least intuitive to use. The player's interaction with the mechanic should have progression and feel rewarding to use. You'll know you're doing it right when the player starts using the mechanic of their own volition and starts reaping the benefits of it in a variety of ways. Bad game design is when you set a goal that is unobtainable. So in the same context as before, say we introduce a new mechanic, but this time neglect to teach the player how to use it and where it can be used. Let's also implement the mechanic in a way that isn't the most intuitive to use. Maybe it controls very awkwardly or can be used in a very limited number of places. The player has no incentive to learn how to use this mechanic because they don't even understand how it would even benefit them if they did. If you then made a later portion of the game that now forces the player to have to use that mechanic that they already decided they didn't want to bother with, they might not even remember that it's a thing. So where do ink ribbons fall specifically? I did not develop Resident Evil, so I have no authority to speak on the behalf of the developers and make a definitive statement on what the goal of the ink ribbons are. That being said, there is an implied goal from the developers related to ink ribbons, the concept of not needing to use them unless absolutely necessary. The player is taught at the very beginning of the game that typewriters can be used to save the game. However, the player is also taught that they need an item to use the typewriter. It says explicitly that they need an ink ribbon. The player is then given only a handful of ink ribbons, teaching that player that they will only get a few at a time. The player is then expected to put 2 and 2 together. I only have a few ink ribbons, so I need to use these carefully right now. The player plays the game a little, then realizes they're not getting a lot of ammo either. So as the player plays the game, they discover ways to bait and juke out the zombies and resolve conflicts without using their gun. Then they start getting creative and taking risks as they get better at the game. Then they finish the game and what do you know? It seems like they actually didn't need all of those ink ribbons after all. I personally feel that the ink ribbons are an indirect incentive to get good at Resident Evil. It's a way to warm up the player to start paying attention to not only their saves, but also the ammunition, the healing items, etc, etc. It sets the player up to not take anything for granted. Because even their precious save data, which other games are willing to hand out for free, is a valuable and limited resource in this game. The goal of the ink ribbons is to instill confidence in the player, not instill confidence in the fact that if they mess up, they can just simply go back to 2 minutes ago. With hopes that eventually a player can beat the entire game without really needing them at all. So no, ink ribbons are not bad game design. They're a clear goal that the player is very easily able to hit, so long as the player is willing to participate in a survival-oriented world. Ink ribbons are not bad game design. They are far from it. As a matter of fact, they elegantly serve their entire purpose, to let the player save their game and nothing more. The ink ribbons allow the player the mercy of picking up the game later or making up the inevitable mistake. But the ink ribbons also prevent the abuse of breaking other facets of the game. This means that ink ribbons are not only good game design, they're also part of the backbone of what makes the entire game so good overall. Which leads me to my conclusion. Hey guys, I was almost done editing this video and then I realized I had a little more to say about this misinformation section. Specifically, I forgot to bring up any positive misinformation I've heard, which are really weird bullshit people say in support of ink ribbons that don't make any sense whatsoever. Or they're used to weave into elitism. That's my main problem. In an effort to not make the video any longer than it already is, because it's already 40 minutes and I don't want to hold you here forever, I'm going to try to briefly go over these. One thing I really don't like about ink ribbons is it kind of breeds elitism. I've especially had this in my mind lately because I started getting very elitist comments on my DMC video, that's fine, you're entitled to whatever opinion, but just know that I'm going to make fun of you a tiny bit if you're like that. A sentiment I hear a lot is that if you're not using ink ribbons, you're not playing Resident Evil, which is kind of absurd. Right now, I want to say that I absolutely condone the use of save states if you really don't want to put up with ink ribbons. While there is an argument to be made that you're kind of robbing yourself a tiny bit from the experience, at the same time, getting really frustrated and annoyed with the game also robs you of the experience of playing the game, so there's sort of like a healthy balance you have to manage. And the cool thing is, now that we can emulate these games, we can play them however we wish, and we can make our experience highly customizable and not put up with the bullshit we really don't want to. I just wanted to get that out of the way for the most part. You're not less of a Resident Evil fan if you play without ink ribbons. That's just absurd. If anyone gives you shit, feel free to point them towards this video because I imagine they have their own misunderstanding about ink ribbons. And if they refuse to watch it, you can give them some of their own medicine and say, well, they're not much of a Resident Evil fan if they can't watch a 40-minute video. I'm just trolling, of course. Obviously, what you should do is ignore them. Another thing that bothers me about ink ribbons that kind of weaves into this is when these elitists shame you for using them and then not using them properly. So for example, let's say you got some shit for using save states, you try out ink ribbons and then it doesn't really mesh with you, and as a result you kind of run out and you're kind of just really stressed out every time you play the game now. And of course, as opposed to understanding, these guys shame you instead and tell you to just get good. I always find this really funny just because of how counterproductive it is. They want you to experience the game in their way, but then you actually comply with their demands and instead you still get shit, so you might as well just not play the game the way they want you to if you're going to get shit regardless. It's a whole stupid thing. Just know that there's positive misinformation about ink ribbons, and these are the two biggest ones. Just straight up elitism. It's really dumb. By the way, if you're one of the people who say these things, you are a total bitch. That's all. Which leads me to my conclusion. Does this mean that ink ribbons should never be annoying? Hell no. If you think ink ribbons bother you, then you can take solace in the fact that save states are a thing these days, and you're not obligated to use this dated system. You also shouldn't let anyone harass you and tell you that you absolutely need to use ink ribbons, or you're missing part of the experience of the game. As long as what you're doing is not hurting anyone, you absolutely do not need to play the game in any specific way that anyone tells you to. You do you. Now, do they make the game worse? Also no. Ink ribbons greatly enhance every aspect of Resident Evil that we associate with these games. Ink ribbons are more than nostalgia. They're a crucial backbone and guardian for all the other mechanics of the game, and they're an invaluable teaching tool. Up until recently, they were practically necessary. It's only in recent times that we learned how to manage without them. Again, that doesn't mean you have to like them, but that also doesn't mean that they're bad game design. Here's a little personal anecdote I wanted to throw in. Just because you don't like something doesn't mean it's bad on a global scale. For many years, I didn't like the game Destiny. To be truthful with you all, I don't really think I had any concrete reason why. I think I just wanted to be a hipster and bash on a game everyone else was playing. But no matter how much I disliked it, it was never going to be the bad game I thought it was back then, just because younger me believed it was. For Destiny to be a bad game, it would have to defy all goals it set out to achieve. It would have to be a game that constantly worked against itself in an effort to destroy every little bit of gameplay that the game had to offer. I was just one person who didn't really have a good reason to call a game bad at all. One thing is for sure, ink ribbons have a good home in Resident Evil. There are so few games out there that would benefit from limited saves the same way Resident Evil does. I hope that after all this explaining and arguing, you all can at least agree on that. If you have any arguments that I left out in this video, feel free to leave them below. Judging by my Devil May Cry video, I wouldn't be surprised if you lovely bunch had a lot of really cool arguments that I haven't even thought of or dredged up in my research for this video. This is a topic I would love to discuss on a much deeper level. I know that when it comes to Resident Evil, there are much more exciting topics, and I do eventually want to fry those bigger fish, but for now, I wanted to start with ink ribbons. We will get to those someday though. For now, everyone have a good night. Speaking of deep topics, if you like Devil May Cry, well, look at that. You stuck around to watch this whole video, so I know you liked it. Here's another one I think you'll like a lot. By the way, do you guys agree with the whole Battle Royale thing? Does this mean that you won? You made it to the end, so I guess maybe you won. I don't know. What do you guys think? YouTube Victory Royale, let's throw a Fortnite gif up there.